Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture Crop Talk webinar. If you have any questions during these presentations today, please type them into the Q&A icon on your Zoom toolbar, and we'll get to them right at the end of each presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. I'd like to welcome everybody to the August 7th edition of Crop Talk. And today we're going to be spending a lot of time with the crop scouting panel. There's been questions that have been coming in, and I think there's things that are happening out there that we can spend most of our time today just getting questions answered. So we're going to start with that. And then towards the end, we're going to go through a little bit of a crop update as to how things look out there. And we're probably going to cover a lot of that as we go through our questions anyway. So I guess with that, we're going to get started here. So with crop scouting panel, we're going to get into our first question. It's going to go to Kim. And so Kim, a couple things on this slide. One question was one producer, this is actually his wheat field, and it's his good land, he says, on the field, and he's getting foxtail growing all the way through it. And he's wondering what he can do to get on top of this, maybe even starting with this fall and trying to stop it from getting throughout the field. And I know I've been noticing foxtail barley, kind of growing in a lot of areas that are not the traditional areas for foxtail barley. So if you can start with that one, Kim.
Okay, thanks, Lionel. Can you guys hear me okay?
A little choppy.
Okay, hang on one second. I will just, sorry, I am en route
better,
to a
Kim.
meeting this morning, so sorry
about
better.
that.
That's better.
Any better? Okay. Okay. So yeah, so with foxtail barley, that's a perennial weed. So those are tougher to get, but this is the time if we're doing any pre-harvest spraying, that's going to be helping with that. If there's a way though, you can stop seed spread on that. If there's a way to get if there's patches that you could mow and maybe burn just to not let that seed spread. It's a simple perennial, so it spreads by seed. So those seed heads are out. I can see a big patch of it right now next to where I'm parked. And those seed heads are out, and those are going to be flying around, and that's going to help it spread. It's a fairly short-lived perennial, so those clumps aren't going to live forever, but it does spread by seed. So right now, when those seed heads are out, if you can stop it from spreading anymore, if that's doable, like I said, some patches that are on the edge of the field or near approaches or things like that are mowable, and you can stop that seed from flying around. But basically, it's a perennial weed, so you need to be going after it, the pre-harvest timing or fall timing type thing. And then my go-to when the next time you get back into wheat is to use the Olympus system, where you've used Olympus as a pre-burn with glyphosate, and then you need to follow that back up in spring wheat with another group 2 in crop, and the combination of those two group 2s together, the Olympus and then whatever you follow it with, and that could be a Vero or Velocity, or it could be Simplicity, or it could be an Everest, it could be something like that, Everest or Sierra. So using that combination of those two group 2s as a pre and then as a post in crop, that does a really good job at taking that down. But that's really only effective obviously in spring wheat. So it's a tougher one to get. It's definitely worse this year. There's a lot of it around, but it's kind of a long-term approach of going after it, with some fall spraying. And then as well, in the wheat where you do have it, where you're going to have a wheat crop, then make sure you use that combination of Olympus plus a post-emergent group 2 to go after it. And that will take those populations down.
Okay. And I guess the biggest question he was having is, it seems to be, this was his comment, he says it's becoming more competitive, and before he said it never used to show up in my good areas. Why is it all of a sudden and growing taller, he said?
Yeah, I don't know about the taller. I haven't really noticed that myself, but yeah, I don't know this particular field that he's talking about. As to why it's showing up more, that's maybe a question more that Marla can answer. I know Marla's on the Crop Talk today. But it's I think it's what they call a facultative halophyte, which means it does really well in salty soils where other crops don't do so well. So when you see more foxtail barley showing up, and even and more kochia and things like that, weeds that do well in salty soils where there's higher salt content and other plants don't do as well, they're not necessary. Then there's a reason. There's for some reason you're getting more saline areas in that soil, and it could be a number of factors. And again, Marla would be able to speak to that far better than I could. But we are probably seeing an increase in salinity when you're seeing foxtail barley. That's one of the reasons why. So when you have a salt issue in those areas, there's higher saline contents, and foxtail barley itself is actually not a really, really competitive weed, or we would see it all through all of our fields like we have wild oats. So it's not that competitive, but it gets into these areas where it does better than other crops growing in that area. And so we see these patches of foxtail barley. So there's some salinity issues going on there. And then the underlying, cause of salinity is to do with water movement. Those salts are soluble, and obviously they're at or near the surface for some reason, based on the underlying, hydrogeology of the land. And so the salts are increasing, and we see weeds like foxtail barley increasing as well because of those salts.
Okay, the next question was if you could give a quick, I know we might do a crop talk on it next week, but maybe just a quick update on where water hemp is being found now.
Yeah, well, the usual places. We're finding it in the southern part of Manitoba, the same places that we found it before. We're going back to those same fields. We almost always find it for the first time in a glyphosate resistant soybean field. That seems to be where they show up the first time. That's certainly not the only place the water hemp is showing up. But when we go back to those fields the next year, and that field is in canola or it's in wheat, we're still finding some plants in those places. So anywhere where there's been water hemp before, it's going to show up again. They are prolific seed producers. So even if we're in a better crop this year, like a more competitive crop, that water hemp is still there. So we're going back to those same places, finding it in the same places we've been finding it for the last few years. But we've got some new infestations now that are showing up. We've got some that are north and west of St. Claude. And then I'm still waiting on confirmation, but I've seen the pictures, and I am, positive that it's showing up in that Neepawa Gladstone area as well. So you need to, some of this background stories. I know in the one case, the farmer had bought a piece of equipment, I think a corn header up from North Dakota a couple of years ago. So it may have been introduced that way. But we know these weeds get introduced a number of different ways. So that's definitely one of the ways it could have got here. They move, this weed moves in the digestive tract of birds. So, they eat it, further south and then deposit it up here when they're flying north. They do the same thing with our weeds. They take them south when they fly south for the winter. So it happens in both directions. But, and then also any waterways, like we know the seeds will float and they do move in flooded land. So anywhere where there's been any overland flooding or any, the ditches have been running, which obviously happened a lot this year. We do know that it'll move from places where there's been seed to new places in that way as well.
Okay, good. Thanks, Kim. And I think there's just one more question for you today. And a few producers have mentioned this to me about the whitening of thistle plants. Seeing a lot of it in the ditches, but some producers says they're seeing it in their fields as well. Can you maybe give us a little bit of insight what's happening there?
Yeah, I can. And this is maybe too where David could talk about it a little bit better than I, so he could maybe chime in a bit later. But that is, I've seen it referred to by a couple of different Latin names, but the most common one I've seen it is Phoma macrostoma. That's actually a disease caused by a bacteria that will infect Canada thistle. It causes them to go white and they will die. Those plants will probably die. Now, Canada thistle is connected with a large underground root system, so it's not going to wipe out entire populations of Canada thistle, but it does wipe out individual plants, and it is a biocontrol method. that's not been commercialized on a large scale, like for our farmers to use. But we do see that, especially in the wet years, because these the bacteria will move around through, through moist conditions, through water splash and things like that. Now, I have seen too that when you see a lot of it in the ditches and stuff, if you're mowing, you can actually help spread it, because that will spread the bacteria around. It only affects Canada thistle. It's not going to get into our crops, but it's a good thing. So, it just takes down those populations a little bit, but it obviously isn't enough to take out all Canada thistle, because, we do have a lot of Canada thistle around. And with it being a perennial weed and us having lots of moisture this year, those perennial weeds have been loving this year, and they've really, taken advantage of that. And they've got an awful lot of top growth on a lot of the perennial weeds. And then, that beefs up that root system too. So something we're seeing like that, I've seen quite a bit of that this year too. And again, I think it's because it's wet, and so we've got good conditions for that disease to take hold. And so anywhere you see that, that is a good thing. It's good, and it just helps us a little bit with our weed control.
Okay. I'm not sure if David is on right now yet. David, if you wanted to make a comment. He mentioned that he might be traveling today, so we'll maybe see if he's going to be on a little bit later. Oh, there you are, David.
Yeah, I just had trouble unmuting. No, I think Kim covered it very well, and it is like a biocontrol. And the great thing about it is it prevents any kind of seed formation in those plants. So this year you've seen a ton of Canada thistle in the ditches along roadways, and there's going to be a lot of fluff floating around carrying seeds. So that's a nice thing to see in your fields.
Great. Okay, thanks, Dave. You'll be getting some questions here coming up. So
sure.
Next one is I guess this would be for Anne and David. Fall rye is getting ready to harvest. Some guys have actually started doing some harvest, and seeing ergot showing up, especially in a lot of headlands. And Anne, if you want to make some comments, and Dave, if you want to comment as well, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah, so I'll have a few comments, and if David wants to add some extra, that would be great. So yeah, we definitely have seen some ergot this year. So ergot infects like rye is most susceptible to ergot. Wheat would be kind of medium in susceptibility, and then barley would be least susceptible to ergot in terms of the cereal crops. But it also affects triticale and brome grasses, like the picture that Lionel has up here. So we usually do see very small reductions in yield with ergot. It probably looks worse than it is. But because those ergot bodies are poisonous to humans and livestock, it can be an issue when marketing grain if you do end up with a lot of ergot bodies or ergot pieces in your grain. So ergot does overwinter in the soil, and it could also overwinter in stored grains. So you need to be careful about keeping a crop for seed that does have a lot of ergot in it. So typically some of those headland grasses or native grasses like brome can get ergot earlier in the season. That infection, like the honeydew that infection produces, can spread to your crop. So if you do see, often we will see ergot more in the headlands of a crop, and that means it's probably spread in from, ditch grasses or the like. If you do see ergot more kind of spread out throughout the entire field, it may have come in through infected seed or from like a previous infection in that field. So you can't really do anything about ergot. There's no real resistant varieties, and there's no fungicides that can control it. So things that we can do to prevent it is to mow those ditch grasses before they come into head, clean your seed before planting to make sure the ergot's removed, and then good crop rotations between susceptible crops. So making sure you have at least a year between rye, wheat, barley, and triticale. When it comes to the reason why we might be seeing more ergot this year is because cool, damp weather does favor both ergot germination and prolonged flowering period. So the more open those flowers are, so some varieties do have like a longer flowering period, and those flowers may be open longer. That does provide more opportunities for ergot to come in, and it really just replaces the seed. So when we do have a cool, damp spring and early summer, like we did have we had a fairly cool and fairly damp spring, you'll have more ergot germination, and then also those flowers will be open longer, allowing more infection to take place. So in these types of years, we do tend to see more ergot infection. David, did you have other comments to add?
Well, really, Anne, you covered it very well. The only thing I might add is that the reason we're seeing it in some of the more self-pollinated crops like wheat is that when you have periods of prolonged rainfall, that causes the glooms to stay open for longer. You know, rye is open pollinated, so the glooms are naturally opened for a length of time. But the more time that they're physically open in a crop like wheat, again, the opportunity for the honeydew stage to get in. And it can be carried by insects, but it can also be splashed into the crop by wind and driving rain.
Okay, and actually, while you guys were talking, it just came to me, this field, the picture of the field here was actually a hay field last year. So the potential for ergot to be more spread throughout the field is probably more than, a regular crop field. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Those grasses generally flower and at a time when the spores are being released from the little drumsticks that come out of ergot bodies. There's almost analogous to the resting bodies of Sclerotinia in that they produce these tiny mushroom-like structures. They look like drumsticks. They produce ascospores, which are blown up into the heads. And so the initial infection happens in those earlier flowering grasses.
Okay, so maybe something producers to think about as a rotation thing is maybe staying away from fall rye on a freshly worked up hay field.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys. The next one is for Anne. I guess we talked at the beginning a bit about crops getting ready to be sprayed and for pre-harvest, and thought maybe we could talk a little bit about that and your comments on pre-harvest in general, Anne, and timing wise.
Sure, I'm just going to share a slide if that's okay with you.
You bet.
Okay, so I believe I'm sharing my screen now, and this is a picture showing staging for pre-harvest glyphosate. Oops. Okay, yeah, so staging for pre-harvest glyphosate. So we do need to be very careful. It can be tricky depending on what your crop looks like this year to do in proper staging. So if your field is a little bit stagey and you have, say, like lower areas some areas that are less mature than others, you do want to be considering what crop the stage is in the least mature part of the field. So for all cereal crops, the pre-harvest glyphosate should be applied when the grain moisture is less than 30%, which is the hard dough stage. So if you do have sections of the field that are more mature and sections that are less mature, you should be looking at the least mature section of the field. And the best way to identify the hard dough stage is with the thumbnail test, and that's the slide I have up here. This is from the Keep It Clean website. So at the hard dough stage, the kernel should be firm, brown, well-developed. When you put your thumbnail into that kernel, if it makes a mark, like a divot from your thumbnail, and that doesn't pop back up, then that's considered hard dough stage. Earlier, like at the soft dough stage, you can put your thumbnail into that kernel and it will pop back up again because it's fairly soft and undeveloped. So that's probably the best way to indicate that your crop is ready for pre-harvest glyphosate. And at that hard dough stage, the kernels have reached their maximum dry weight, so you won't be losing any yield from stopping the development of those kernels. In terms of pre-harvest herbicide options, so glyphosate is a herbicide and not a desiccant. So the most commonly used herbicides for pre-harvest management would be glyphosate, and that would be for weed control prior to harvest. Dicot would probably be the most common, so like Reglone, Heat, AIM, and Valterra. So products like dicot or heat or desiccants, dicot does result in the most rapidly dried down green plant material. So that happens the fastest. Heat and Valterra do take slightly longer to dry down material. And AIM is one of the slower acting desiccants. So sometimes it's partnered with glyphosate for desiccation and weed control. So just kind of an overview of what products people might be considering and making sure that the timing is appropriate.
Okay, thanks, thanks, Anne. I'm gonna just grab the screen back here. And off to the next question. David, there's been a lot of us out in fields lately doing some checking for fusarium and other disease surveys. So far, what have you been seeing, and as far as fusarium in spring wheat this year?
Well, we're about halfway through our fusarium survey in wheat, and there is a lot more this year as far as incidence, or sorry, prevalence. That is how many fields have some fusarium showing. But as far as incidence goes, I'd say that it's a range from 0 to the highest we've heard is 30% incidence. And that was one of the earlier surveyed field. Now, 30% sounds like a lot, but in that case, I talked to the surveyor, and most of the infections were not like the one you see in the lower right corner. They were a single spikelet, or maybe two spikelets. So depending on the size of the heads, that's probably around maximum of, say, 15% of the total grain that might be affected. And so it's in the range of 4% Fusarium head blight index. And also those kernels that are infected, I think we're seeing that if you open the glooms, they are not going to be full-sized kernels that are FDK. They're very small and withered and so light that they are likely to be blown out of the back of the combine at harvest. And so rarely in this case would you see, say, 4% FDK showing up in your grain sample. It's probably going to be 0.5% or less, but that can still be a grading issue. So when you see that high incidence, you might think about harvest management in order to minimize the amount of FDK that show up in the harvested grain.
Yeah, that's a good point about opening up the head and seeing. It seems like those kernels are, in my opinion, anyways, from the ones I've seen, they don't look like they're going to make. There's not much of a kernel inside there, so I don't think they're really going to make it into the hopper and probably blow out the back of the combine. So
yeah,
that's what I've been seeing so far as well.
That's right. In the last crop pest update, I threw in a little picture that, excuse me, was grain I threshed out of my plot early, April maturity that Ann talked about, and the infected kernels in that case were still a similar size to the hard vitreous kernels, the normal ones. And so those do have the potential for ending up in the harvested grain.
Okay, great. Thanks. I've seen those pictures as well, Dave. Yeah, there was definitely some that would land up in the hopper. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next question is going to go to Marla. Before we got going today, we were talking at this time of year, there's kind of a bit of a break between getting ready for harvest and done fungicide applications. So producers are out looking at some of their fields and and wondering, making plans for next year. And one of the questions I get a lot is, looking at seeding down some of these saline areas, but the common question you get is, how bad are your saline areas? So first of all, I guess, how can a producer determine how bad his saline area is? And then the next question is, what are some of the better things he can be seeding in those areas? So Marla, if you could take it away.
You bet. So, yeah, this is a good question, and we see this a lot with the idea of, how do I manage it? But the first question always is, how bad are we talking about? And if we're talking about the idea of seeding down a saline tolerant forage into some of these areas, you do want to know how bad it is, because that can help target what type of forage you want to get growing. You don't necessarily have to go to the most salt tolerant if it's not a super saline area. And Kim already touched on some of this earlier, the idea of managing things like foxtail barley. Foxtail barley and kochia are those kind of two top salt tolerant weeds that we end up seeing in these really bad areas. And so if you're noticing problems, then you've likely got some kind of salinity issue. And noticing that now gives you an idea of where we need to actually go and do some soil testing later on. So if you are doing soil testing in those saline areas, again, you want to just focus on the spots, not the rest of the field. And you want to take that soil test from the 0 to 6 and the 6 to 24-inch depth. And those depths are critical because a lot of those salts are coming up from below. And so while you're seeing them on the surface, you don't necessarily know how bad it is down below. Also, if you're not seeing that white crust on the surface, sometimes again, the weeds are showing you that you've got a salt problem. It may not look that saline at the surface, especially if it's been very wet and some of that has been diluted and maybe moved down in that top 6 inches, but you'll find those salts deeper in that profile. And so it's important to be able to look at both. You don't necessarily have to do a full spectrum of soil analysis. In a case like this, we really just want to focus on that salt test. And so that's that electrical conductivity test, EC soluble salts. It will come up on various different soil analyses in a different way. They'll word it sometimes, again, EC, electrical conductivity, or soluble salts. There are units that differ from lab to lab. So the unit may say decisiemens per meter, DS/M. It might say millisiemens per centimeter, MS/cm. It might say millimhos, mmHo. S per centimeter. All of those units are equal. The important part is that when you're doing an analysis, you're getting the cheap, simple analysis of a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 water to soil test done, and it's fast, it's easy, it's quick for the lab to do. So you want to ask for that analysis, or just that basic analysis. You don't need to have a saturated paste test done, which is more expensive. You just need the basic soil, cheaper kind of salt analysis. I'm going to share my screen quickly just to show what we're talking about when we look at the salt tolerance. And just to be able to see, when we're talking about this idea of salt tolerance, how tolerant is tolerant? So when I mentioned that foxtail barley, kochia, like these are very, very tolerant weeds. They manage a very high amount of salinity. And so they will grow in more moderate and kind of lower salt levels as well, but they can tolerate and be competitive in these very high saline areas where basically the rest of the crop just isn't competitive. The important part here is, again, this is in that decisiemens per meter. The unit doesn't matter. The number would be 16.84, depending on if it was millisiemens per centimeter or millimhos per centimeter. The number would be the same because the units are essentially meaning the same thing. The important parts here, though, is when you are looking at some kind of salinity tolerance of crops, whether it's an annual crop or forage like this screen is showing, the critical part of this is the fact that salt tolerance in crops is analyzed using the saturated paste test. And the saturated paste test is $20 more at least per sample. It's more expensive because it takes more lab space and lab time. So what they do is they take, the amount of the soil that is being analyzed, they mix just enough water to make a slurry or a paste. So it's not equal parts. It's not that quick quick test that gets done on the lab. And they mix it together. They make this slurry. They put that slurry into a filter, and then they draw that off with suction, and draw the water off, and then analyze the water. And so it will be a higher number because it's less diluted with water. And the reason they do this is it gives a better idea of what the root is actually growing through in the soil solution, so they can get a really accurate number or an idea of how much salt is in the soil solution that the root is growing through. If we add all that extra water, again, it's more diluted, so it's not showing the actual root experience. The issue with that test, again, because it's more expensive, it does align nicely with what what the crop experience or the tolerance is going to be. But I don't expect farmers to go and spend a whole bunch of money getting that type of analysis just to compare to this chart. So here, this salt tolerance level, the rule of thumb is you take this number and you divide it by 2 in order to compare to your soil test. Now, it's a rule of thumb. It's not exact. The number is divided by, 1.7 to 2.3, essentially, depending on whether or not the soil is a sand or clay. And so there is a range, which is why we just go to the number 2 and use the number 2 as our kind of general rule of thumb. So if I take this number and then I click here, this is going to compare to the lab test. So now if you're looking at your lab analysis and the lab analysis is 8 or higher, you are in this zone of forages that you need to be able to grow in order to be that salt tolerant. If you're in the lower tolerance, you can get away with growing things that don't have to have that same level of salinity tolerance in those areas. The reality is, if you're in this level, these lower levels, you're probably growing annual crops there anyway, because they will actually grow quite well. But if you're getting into these, the wheat grasses, the wild rye, things like that, this is where you get into those high salt tolerances. Recognize that something like AC Saltlander, which is developed from the salt lab in Swift Current, it's an excellent salt tolerant green wheatgrass. It takes a while to get established. So it's going to take, 3 years before these forages look good. The other problem that we often think about too is that we're establishing these forages at a period of time when the salts are really high. And so we're doing it when we're in high kind of salinity periods, where we should actually be thinking about trying to establish them when the salts are a little lower. Usually those high salinity periods are accompanied with drought or just following droughts. And so it's not an easy time to get a forage established. So we need to be thinking about establishing these forages maybe when the salts aren't looking so bad, after we've had a little extra rain. And a year like this, where we've had a lot more moisture, might be helping us get to that point where we might be able to establish them a little bit better. But if we have dry surface soils, it's going to be harder to get these little forages getting going.
Okay, Marla, I guess one question is how high of a level have you seen? Like, you had 16 and then it went down to 8. What would you say was some of the highest levels you've seen?
I have seen levels get up to into that 8. I've also had calls of farmers asking about how to remediate and deal with levels in the 5 to 6 range. More commonly, I would say, and those are very high levels. So that 5 to 6, based on the chart that I was just showing, would be a 10 to 12. So and quite often the question that I'll get around those high levels too is, well, can I do anything like tile drainage in order to manage it rather than having to seed it down? And tile drainage can help to leach those salts out as long as there is enough precipitation falling on the soil to move those salts deeper into the profile, down into that soil, like down deeper and through those tiles. The issue is that it takes a lot of water in order to do that. And so we have to have years of excess precipitation beyond what the crop is using in order to actually see that leaching happen. And as a result of that, it may take many, many years to lower, especially an extreme salinity area issue. So while we can lower kind of mild salinity in those areas, when you're in that 5 to 6 range, those are really hard to manage in a shorter period of time. And even, seeding them down, once you've seeded them down and that forage is growing, and it actually helps to keep the creep of that salinity up the hill. Like earlier when that question was asked about the foxtail barley, why am I seeing it grow in areas where it hasn't grown before? If these saline patches are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and you're starting to get that mild salinity that's impacting the crop's ability to be competitive, and the foxtail barley is taking over in those regions, then that salinity creep is happening. If you can keep it smaller by managing and using up the water in those lower areas, you're actually in a better situation for the long term. But it is a long-term solution. We can't put a forage down into a saline area and then say, okay, 10 years later, things look good. I'm going to take it out and put it back into annual crop production. You're going to have the same problem come back. It's an inherent issue with water movement through that soil. These are natural salinity areas quite often that exist because we are managing the soil in a less natural way because we don't have a permanent crop growing all the time as there would have been when the land had been naturally grasslands, let's say. And so when we take that management and that crop growth out from being all the time and just going to an annual crop that's going to take up water for 90 to 100 days, then we know that we're going to be creating a bit more of an issue. And so it's a permanent kind of long-term management strategy if you're talking about seeding down salinity areas. And there's a cost associated with it. There's additional management around it. It is an issue. I fully recognize that. But it's also taking poor land out of production that wasn't going to make you money in the first place. So it is important to focus on that. And if anybody is looking at doing these types of practices, we have had BMPs associated with this in our SCAP funding around perennial forages for sensitive lands, and that would include salinity management.
Great. That's some really good points, Marla, and good thing for mentioning some of those BMPs, because I think a lot of producers should take advantage of those, especially if they're looking at seeding some stuff down. And a real good point regarding the tile draining. Definitely been seeing maybe this year with a little bit more rainfall, a lot of those tiles running more often than on a drier year. That's for sure.
Yeah, and the thing with the tiles I would add too is it's important to note, like in a year like this where it has been wet, there's been more water moving down through the soil profile out those tiles. Occasionally you'll have tiles running that isn't necessarily because there's been a lot of rainfall pushing down. Sometimes it's tile because there's water coming up from below. So it is helping to decrease the water table kind of push from the underground flow of soil of water moving up. But sometimes the tile is flowing even when you don't have excessive precipitation. So that doesn't necessarily mean that salinity is going down. So again, the tile flowing has to also come from salts moving downward through excess precipitation flowing through that profile.
Okay, good points. Thanks, Marla. Okay, next question. John Gavloski, I guess we've been dealing with a few insects and some pictures have been coming in, and figured I'd put up a kind of a slide of some of the stuff we've been seeing, and maybe get you to make a few comments here, and then we'll just continue on with more of the insect questions. So if you want to start with this one and maybe go through the different ones on the screen right now.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so I'll start with the grasshopper that's clinging to the top of the plant. And so what's happening here is this is caused by a fungal pathogen called Entomophaga grylli, as often referred to as summit disease. And entomophaga is actually an appropriate name because entomo means insect, and phaga means to eat. So this is essentially a insect-eating fungus, and this species of fungus is actually very specific to grasshoppers. It kind of changes their behavior a bit. Once they get infected, when they get into the later stage of their infection, they will, it kind of alters their brain, and they will climb to the very top of the plant and cling on very tightly, usually with their head pointing up. Often the abdomen will swell up quite a bit, sometimes almost double the size of what it normally would be when they're really loaded with spores. And there could be several million spores per grasshopper. Being high in the canopy, it really benefits the fungus because eventually, after the grasshopper dies, its body will start disintegrating, and being high in the canopy, that allows the spores to spread um, over a wider area where other grasshoppers can encounter them. There are different strains or pathotypes of this fungus, which are somewhat specific. So there's a strain that only affects grasshoppers in the genus that includes our two-striped and migratory grasshopper, Melanopus, which is likely what is the strain here. There's another strain that only affects things in the bandwing grasshoppers, so things like our clear-wing grasshoppers. And then there's a third strain that was actually introduced, I believe from Australia, and it affects more multiple groups, so clear-winged and our Melanopus species. It's not something that we can mass produce and use as an insecticide. It'd be hard to rear, and it's very weather specific, but it is something that shows up naturally in the fields, so it helps out. The photo on the upper right, which almost look like eggs, they're not really eggs. They're pupal cases of a parasitic wasp called Cotesia, and they're in a big cluster, so they look like eggs. They probably came from an armyworm or another type of caterpillar. We were seeing a fair amount of these pupal clusters this year in fields that had armyworms. So what was happening here was a very tiny black wasp was flying around, laying eggs into the caterpillars. Usually they lay anywhere from about 20 to 60 eggs in a caterpillar, and they're all the same age. So what happens, the caterpillars get sick. Eventually they also climb to the top of the plants and they die up there. The larvae of the wasp, which have been living inside the caterpillar and feeding on it, again, they're all the same age. They emerge from the caterpillar instantaneously. It happens within a minute or two. And they form this cluster, they're clusters of pupae in a big group at the top of the plants. Sometimes you'll see the dead caterpillar corpse below the pupal cluster as well if it hasn't dropped off or blown off. So this is a good thing. It means that we had some parasitism in our armyworms. And the final picture down below, armyworm on a forage grass, was probably taken earlier in the summer. We did go through one cycle of armyworm larvae already. Our pheromone-based traps showed that the adult moths migrated in it was early and mid-June is when the moth migration happened this year, laid their eggs. From late June through to about mid-July, we had the caterpillars doing their feeding. There was some economic damage in some areas, so they've turned to pupa. We probably will start getting adults coming out really soon for the second generation. That second generation usually is not of significance. By the time the larvae get going, the crops will be getting harvested probably. And also the crops won't be as attractive to the egg-laying females later in the season. They're going to look for lush, very lush green, grassy areas to lay their eggs. So the ditches and things may be a bit more attractive than a drying down wheat or barley field or forage grass field late in the season. So usually it's generation 1 with armyworms that causes most of the issues.
Okay, so we'll go to the next slide here. And seeing these pop up in some of the soybeans fields, I know I've seen them in sunflowers before. So John, you want to make a few comments on what we're seeing here?
Yeah, so this is something called thistle caterpillar. And they call them thistle caterpillar not because they're prickly like thistles, but because their favorite food plant is actually thistles. But they will show up in soybeans and sunflowers as well. So they're the larval stage of a butterfly called the painted lady butterfly. Painted lady butterflies, they overwinter in Mexico and Southern California, so quite far south. And they actually have a purposeful migration. If populations get very high where they're overwintering, they will migrate north. Some years we barely see them. Other years we see a bit more of them. And I'll say very occasionally, very rarely, they do get to economic levels where they could be doing crop damage. I don't think that's the case this year. I haven't heard of or seen any fields that look like they'd be nearly economical. Usually when they're economical is where levels are really high and we also have drought conditions and the plants just can't compensate for the defoliation they're doing. They're a very visible insect though, which makes it maybe a bit distressing for farmers and crop scouts. They're often high in the canopy. They're large. They make that webbing that you see, and you'll see their fecal pellets inside the webbing. So that the brown or the black that you see there in the web, that's not eggs. Larvae don't lay eggs. That's just the fecal pellets from the larvae. As mentioned, thistles are their favorites. If there's any thistles around, they will concentrate their populations there. If the thistles have been sprayed out at some point or cleaned up, then they will lay eggs or move on to things like soybeans, sunflowers. The foliation thresholds are pretty high. So if you are seeing what you think are high levels, get in touch and we can talk about whether controls would be economical or not. One thing I'll note though, if you're crop scouting, if you have, say, even 1 in 20 plants that has a thistle caterpillar on it, especially in soybeans, the field can look horrible. Usually that's just in patches, but it can look really distressing. But the economics of it probably aren't tremendous. There's been exceptional situations where people have had to control them in soybeans and sunflowers previously, but again, it's not a common thing for us to need to control.
Yeah, that's you definitely when you do see them, you see the mess they make, and you get worried, especially when they're curling up the leaves. But yeah, I've never really seen where they've done a whole bunch of damage. There's been some talk again about aphids and amount of aphids starting to show up. This was a picture I took last year. Any comments on aphids, John, and any damage that they're doing? Any concerns of any part of the province with aphids right now?
So yeah, first of all, really good photo. You've got a lot going on there. There's aphids feeding in your photo. There's also in the lower right-hand corner a inflated bronzed colored aphid, which is a parasitized one. So that's what we call an aphid mummy. So yes, you've got the cursor on it right now. That's yeah, so that one's got a wasp larva living inside it. It's essentially a dead aphid at this point and has become a nice home for the aphid. But you can see in this case, this is English grain aphid in your photo, and they like to cluster in the heads of the grains. The threshold that we use is a 12 to 15 per stem on average. There are some fields in the province where levels have or had reached that. There's been a little bit of spraying, but I wouldn't say a lot of spraying. for aphids and cereals. In quite a few fields, we're now seeing a lot of lady beetles, lacewing larvae, and I had someone text me some photos yesterday of hoverfly larvae they were seeing on the cereal heads, and that confuses a lot of people because they look like slugs. They're legless and almost slug-like, and they can be gray, brown, green, various colors. So they're starting to show up too. So some people are trying to factor in the natural enemies. The other thing to consider is the stage of your crop. Aphids are the crop is susceptible up until about soft dough. Once you get soft dough and beyond, your yield potential is pretty much set. The aphids that are there won't be doing economic damage beyond that. So that's one thing to consider. The other consideration is chemical control options are slim. There's two active ingredients registered for aphids in small grains. One is dimethoate, which is your Saigon, and it has a 35-day pre-harvest interval, which in a lot of cases makes it really not acceptable. The other active that's registered is malathion, which is not easy to get right now. So it makes it tricky for people who do go above threshold and have a field that could benefit from a spray. We desperately need more options registered for aphids and small grains, and particularly it would be great to have a selective option, something like a carbine, Safina, or any of the aphicides that work well on aphids but don't kill all the other things. Be nice to have one of those registered in cereal crop. So if there's any chemical company reps in there, there's a plug. We need some more selective options for aphids and cereals.
Okay, and then if you take a look at the picture on the top right
Yes.
hand, I guess, if you can maybe make a comment on that. I did get a couple of questions, or I got a question yesterday regarding that in the field.
Yeah, so there's several things that can cause whiteheads in fields. Some insect related and others either pathogen related or more environmental. One of the common ones that we see is something called wheat stem maggot. And it's an easy one to diagnose because they're a larva that feeds right inside the stem, usually fairly high up in the plant, and they will sever the stem. So the head will still be upright, protected by the sheath, so it's not falling over, but it's turned white because things have been severed down below. And if you were to try to tug on that wheat head, it will pull out really easily if it's wheat stem maggot. So if you can give that a tug and it just slides right out with no effort, that'll be wheat stem maggot. That's caused by a fly larva, kind of a very pale green colored larva that would be inside the stem. There's nothing registered. It's nothing you can spray for. It's, again, a highly visible thing, but it's usually not economical. Once again, if you have, say, 1 in 30 or 1 in 40 heads in your field that turn white like that, it looks horrible, but it's probably not economical. And there's nothing registered for wheat stem agate regardless. So if it's just the odd head here and there, put the blinders on. By the time you see it, the damage is already done. And again, there's really nothing you could do about it anyway. So it's not like you missed scouting for something. This is one that just shows up and you really can't effectively monitor and manage it.
Okay, so yeah, we've been seeing that, pretty much see that every year, and it's like you said, something you can't manage. So next slide, and I think you talked a bit about this already, but I seen this, I guess, a couple days ago, and just let people know what that is.
Yeah, I've had calls on these before from people who are confused because sometimes you see lots of them. And the one call I got, they were describing them as potato beetle larvae, and they were all over their crop, which wasn't potatoes. In this case, what you're seeing there is a ladybug or lady beetle pupa. So this is the intermediate stage. The larval stage of our lady beetles look like little black or grayish alligators. And this is the pupa stage. And of course, the adults would be your red with black dot adults. So this is going through that intermediate stage. We've been getting lots of reports of lady beetles of all different stages in peas, cereal crops, and pretty much any of the crops that have aphids in them. So that's good. They're helping us out somewhat. And you've got some peas in the photo off to the side. Right now, we're probably getting to the point where aphids and peas are becoming less economical. Even if you do have some higher levels, once the seeds are filling the pods, the susceptible period is pretty much over with, and you don't really have to worry about them once most of the pods have bumps in them.
Okay, so thanks, John. I think, just yeah, this one was one that I got from a person in town that just something going on in their tree, and was wondering if we had you on. I can throw that one at you too.
Yeah, so these are galls. There's different types of galls that are caused by different things. When you are seeing galls, it's too late to really do anything because there's depending on the type of gall, that can be caused by a mite, an aphid, or a wasp larva, and they're living inside the gall. The gall is basically its home, and there's no way you can really effectively control them. They're it's more aesthetics than it is economical. Gulls usually aren't killing branches or trees. It's strictly aesthetics. So sometimes it's just a matter of accepting that they're there, because at this point, there's nothing you'd be able to do about it anyway.
You bet. Good. Thanks, John. Just a few more things before we finish up today. Dennis couldn't be with us today, but a lot of the soybeans out there in the R2 to R4 stage, probably the majority in the R3 stage is beginning potting. And I had a question from a producer who was wondering, he's out in his field and he's seeing all the flowers out there, and he was wondering how long they're going to flower for. So Dennis was telling me that they usually will flower until the late R5 stage, and after that, they just start losing some of their flowers. So they're still going to flower for a bit. If we get some rain, like some areas got, I think this is going to definitely help out the soybeans and can get them to help finish filling. So definitely something that rainfall is what we need in August. That's always kind of the term for soybeans. We need a rain in August, and I think some of the areas have been getting them. A few things showing up as well. The browning on the top of the leaf there in the middle of the screen, more of a sunburn on the soybeans, so nothing major to worry about. And then the one on the bottom right you're seeing is basically it's just a infection that starts with a smaller angular with a yellow spot around it, and again usually happens when we get higher moisture amounts and humidity. So again, a lot of the plants, I'm not seeing a lot of this out there. I think it's something that we're gonna definitely plants are going to be past the stage where it's going to be too much of an effect on them.
Yep. That's bacterial blight, by the way,
Yeah,
Lionel.
sorry. Yeah, I meant to say bacterial blight. Yeah.
You can see a little tearing on one of the other leaves, and that is another common symptom when you have a lot of lesions in the same part of the leaf.
Okay, good. So, and the black spot or the brown spot with the yellow halo, that's kind of the key thing, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Dennis. Or thanks, David. Sorry. Comment about peas. They're getting closer. I think the biggest thing I want to take away with this slide is you need to get out into your field and really scout it. A lot of the lower areas and areas where disease started to show up are ripening in fast and turning brown. So we're going to have a lot of different stages out there. I think the biggest thing when you're going to be looking at assessing your field for spraying peas is to go out and assess a lot of those green areas and make sure you're not out there too quick. Some of those lower areas that got disease are ripening fast, and when you get right out into them, they're not as good a crop in some of those areas as the rest of the field. So it's going to be a judgment call when you go to spray them. But I think the biggest thing there is to get out and assess the whole field and don't just go by what it looks like from the road. That's for sure. Spring wheat quality, again, something that's on our crop report. So if you're looking to see where we sit as a province, probably the majority of the crop is still in the good to fair situation. I think most of it is probably in the good situation right now. And with, again, as long as we don't get too big of rain events, I think some areas are getting some larger events that could maybe cause some damage. But right now we're probably in the good situation. Canola, and I got a picture of John out there doing some sweeping, but the earliest seeded canola is in the pod fill to early ripening stage. The last fields seeded are still flowering, and even some of the early seeded fields, we might be starting to see some color change. So still a little ways away from canola being ready to do any type of harvesting, but it's definitely getting closer every day here. Something Anne gave me that I thought was be good to put on is we need wheat samples needed for research study. And so if you're interested in grabbing some samples as you get into harvest here, the sample size isn't very big. It's only 300 grams. And what they're doing is the goal is to provide Manitoba growers with information to be considered in breeding programs for increasing wheat resistance to climate impact and reduce losses related to pre-harvest sprouting. So if you're interested, you can give myself a call or send an email to us, and we can get you more information. But basically what you're needing to do is to just grab a 300-gram sample when we get into harvest. So we'll have more maybe next week when we'll get Anne to maybe go through it and give you all the procedures. MCDC is on today. Tomorrow is PCDF. So if you're still interested in attending one of the diversification centers field days, you still got today in Carberry and tomorrow in Roblin. And I put this up last week, thought it would be good to put it up again. It's basically just a seeded acreage compared to what it was last year and some interesting changes. Crop residue burning program has started as of August the 1st. So if you're going to be looking at doing any burning or crop residue, definitely make sure you're in burning on a day that's eligible to burn. Otherwise, you're required to get a permit. There's the website for the crop residue burning, as well as the Manitoba hay listing service. So if you got hay for sale, and we mentioned that there's potential for some good yields in the province this year, so there might be some hay for sale. So good opportunity to market your hay there. Our MASC service centers contact information as we get more and more into the harvest time period. If you got any questions, give those numbers a call. And mine and Lori's contact information. So if you've have any questions about what you've seen today, or questions about anything that's happening, I guess, in the industry, just feel free to contact us, and we'll do our best to get answers and maybe get somebody on next Crop Talk to talk about it. So with that, I don't see any questions. So thanks for attending, and we will see you next week, August the 14th.